among all the many things Jesus talks about, all the many things Jesus does, certainly education is at the absolute center of what Jesus came to do. And sometimes when they will summarize the whole trajectory of the gospel, they'll say all that Jesus began to do and to teach. And both the doing and the teaching are critical. And today we're going to be focusing on the teaching. And as I said, there's just so much we could get into with Jesus as a teacher. We could point out that he's regularly called a teacher throughout the Gospels. Rabboni, didaskale, all these Greek and Aramaic words that get used for master or teacher. And while the Gospels are at pains to say he's not just a teacher, right? He's certainly more than a teacher as the Messiah of Israel, the Son of God, very God of very God. Nonetheless, he's not less than a teacher. He does instruct all over the place. And he's a great teacher, unsurprisingly. First of all, he's very clear when he teaches. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. There's no kind of accommodation or obfuscation in the sense of just chattering away and no one can comprehend him because he's using his PhD language. Speaks very clearly. Having said that, he's very clever in his teaching. Right? So we know about his parables, which deliberately veil aspects of the message from people who might be hostile to him, like the political forces. Is he threatening my kingdom? I don't know. Seems like no, but then I wonder. Well, that's because he was a clever teacher in putting his message in a certain way that could be understood only by those who cared enough to really probe. Furthermore, when he shows up in Jerusalem during Holy Week, Passion Week, and they're always trying to trip him up, and his answers are so clever. Remember when they bring him the coin and say, "Hey, Jesus, is it lawful to pay the tax?" And they think they've got him by the horns and can just wrestle him to the ground. And he says, "Can I see that coin?" He says, "Who is this guy?" Caesar. And they already know probably in their guts, like something's gone horribly wrong because they're the ones who should be asking questions, but he just asks a question in return. Whose likeness is it? Caesar's. Says, well, if it belongs to him, why don't you give it back to him then? If it belongs to God, what belongs to God? Give it to God. And then the Sadducees try to get him with this question about the resurrection. Again, he just parries it. And after they keep trying and trying, and he says, in almost Columbo-like fashion, as a master educator, fellas, you've been asking me so many questions. Would you mind if I ask you one question? I'll just ask one question. David in the Psalm says, the Lord said to my Lord. So if David calls the Messiah my Lord, how could he be David's son? In other words, would he be less than David if David calls him my Lord? I don't know what to say about that. And he gives him a bonus. Do you believe John the Baptist? Because he pointed towards me. I'm like, well, if we say we don't believe him, the crowds will get mad at us because they think John's a prophet. If we say we do believe him, we're stuck because he pointed to Jesus. So we don't know what to say. And Jesus said, well, that's good because I'm not going to answer your questions either. So we're done here. He's just incredibly clever. And finally, he's a very challenging teacher, right? It's easy to be a teacher who just feeds the pre-existing prejudiced outlooks of your students, right? Just give the people what they want. That's a wonderful way to be popular. But a real teacher is going to challenge people to transcend where they're at to become more than they currently are. And that's what Jesus does time and again, whether it's through the fact he speaks in parables. He challenges his students, his disciples to learn and to grow cognitively, whether it's challenging the Pharisees to rethink their whole religious outlook. Whatever it is, Jesus is not afraid to challenge his learners and to call them to somewhere higher. So our focus passage today will be one of my favorites. I talk about it all the time and whenever I get half an opportunity, and it's the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus on the road to Emmaus. I love it because if anywhere, this is where we can see that the Bible is a divine comedy, that it has a happy ending, and I think there are even a few laughs to be found along the way. So the story may be familiar to you, but we'll rehearse it again. The particular emphasis on Jesus as a teacher. It says, now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about everything that had happened, the death of Jesus, the word from the women about resurrection, which these guys don't believe. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? They stood still, their faces downcast. They're all gloomy. One of them, named Cleopas, and I always humorously wonder, like, did Cleopas go to the mailbox one day and get his copy of the Gospel of Luke, and he's all excited, and then his wife is reading along with him. She says, you told him to, like, leave your name out of that account where you said, like, the stupidest thing in the Bible. I think so. Oh, Cleopas. Look here on page 24, or scroll 24. Cleopas asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know these things that have happened there in these days? And that's one of my favorite moments in all the Bible, and one of Jesus's greatest moments as an educator, because you've all been in situations where some young punk, typically male but not necessarily, raises his hand and challenges the teacher, right? Like, what do you know about molecular biology or physiology or whatever it is they're teaching? And this person, just in astounding ignorance, just thinks they know it all, and you're just waiting for the teacher to lay into that student and bring him down to size. So of all the dumb things people have said when they raise their hand in a classroom, few really transcend this. And I do think Luke intends us to see some humor here. I certainly hope so, because I teach this this way all the time. So I don't want to be in trouble with either Jesus or Cleopas, or Luke for that matter. He says, the only one who doesn't know what's happening. And Jesus, with remarkable self-restraint, says, yeah, sure, who am I? What do I know? And just says, oh, what things? You know, clearly I don't know what's going on. So why don't you inform me, Mr. Know-it-all? He doesn't say all the things that I would have been tempted to say in that position. But he says about Jesus of Nazareth, they replied, a prophet powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. Chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we'd hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. What's more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it was just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus. And no coincidence, footnote here, that it's women who are the witnesses here, just as way back at the beginning of Luke's gospel, it's the women who are relatively honored by their belief that God can do miracles, while the high-status man, Zechariah, is relatively humbled. He's a good guy, so he makes it back in the end. But women are the testifiers there in the beginning of Luke's gospel, and so it proves here again at the end, as God turns the social expectations upside down, and unless you're willing, like these disciples weren't willing, to embrace the testimony of the women, you're going to be relatively dishonored for a while, and your experience of the risen Christ is going to be delayed somewhat. So Jesus, maybe because they've been unwilling to listen to the witness of those he's appointed, says, how foolish you are and slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? So again, we see that Jesus continues to be a challenging teacher. He's not just all, oh, that's fine. You're okay. Let me help you along and understand. He'll lay it out there. Do your job, or whatever tough coach speak you want to imagine. In comparison with this, Jesus is willing to give them a pretty clear rebuke. But he doesn't just leave them with that and walk away and say, I'm going to go find some other disciples. It says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And so you would think that the lesson here is done. But Jesus, the master teacher, has one more and even a more critical lesson than what was presumably the world's greatest Bible study, right? As they're walking along, he tells them how the entire Bible fits together and addresses Jesus himself. We wish we were there, but we're not. We have one more lesson to learn. As they were approaching the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. So he gives a little like fake, a little pedagogical tool, a little teachable moment where he says, I'm going to give these guys one last shot. Because it might seem at this point, as we have moved through the story, that these fellas are more or less irredeemable, uncoachable, unteachable, right? And so we're left as readers wondering, is there going to be any redeeming quality in these guys that can save the situation? And Jesus is going to call that out of them by this little move to say, I'm going to keep moving on. And this is where the disciples show they got one thing which is going to help save the situation. Jesus goes on as if he were going to proceed farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, for it's nearly evening, the day is almost over. And so he went in to stay with them. Throughout the Gospel of Luke, arguably the supreme Christian virtue is hospitality, welcoming Jesus and one another into homes. And why is that? It's because God is the great host who welcomes us into his home, who welcomes us into his family. That's the point of the Gospel of Luke. And so these guys, seeing the stranger who they're beginning to wonder, who is this guy, but they don't know, nonetheless, they're not just going to let him walk off into the night with bandits and wolves and who knows what else besetting him. They welcome him in. And that's when Jesus, the teacher, gives a little silent fist pump, because he knows that these guys can get it. And in some sense, they have got his message. And now he, in fairly literal terms, turns the tables, as we say, on them, or turns the table on them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, that should sound familiar to us, and began to give it to them. So they welcome him in as if they're going to host him. And that's a wonderful testimony to the fact that if they haven't learned anything else, they've learned to be hospitable. But in the end, they are only willing to host him, they're only able to host him because Jesus himself is the great host. And so, as I said, he turns the table, takes the bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and at that point, their eyes are opened and they recognize him, and he disappeared from their sight. The lesson has been offered, and now he can move on to other things. And so we see from this story a couple of critical things. We see Jesus's, we'll call it professorial patience, not just giving up on these guys when they think, well, you're the only one who doesn't know what's going on. He's patient with them. He's challenging, as we've seen. He is presumably instructive. We don't get the whole lesson, but we get pointed towards the lesson, and I think we're on safe ground to say it was a good Bible study at that point. But more than that, he doesn't just offer them information, he offers them himself. That there's a personal commitment to the well-being of those he's instructing. In fact, that's the whole point of the instruction, is to bless them, not just to fill up their heads. Okay, well, without further ado then let's call our panelists up. You know who you are.
I'm Lynn Marcotte. I've been a professor of English for the past 27 years. I can't believe I'm saying that. At Gordon, 3 years prior to that at Salem State. I also, besides teaching English classes, work in the Academic Support Center, supporting students in their writing. I train writing tutors, and I supervise the writing tutors. If
I'm correct, much of what you do would be one-on-one dialogue with students working on their writing. And what are the kind of the pluses and minuses of that? You must see professors with these big lecture halls, and that might seem more education-y, and yet here you are grinding it out with people, trying to get them to not use so many passives and to not split their infinitives and all the different things you do. How have you seen that both to be a challenge and a blessing?
As a writing teacher, I do work one-on-one a lot with students. The class I'm teaching right now, I conference with students on every single essay they write. So, put that time in with them individually to talk about what they're working on. And when you're writing, it's so personal, and it comes out of this really deep place in you. So you deal a lot with a student's self-image, with their past experiences as students, things that they felt like they were not successful in. And so sometimes you're doing more than teaching them not to split their infinitives, as Sean said, but trying to empower them that they can do this, that they can learn, that they can change, that the story hasn't been written for them, that they can become good writers. And so that, I think, is the exciting part of my job, is I get to be that instrument in their lives, and it's such a blessing to me to see that light bulb go on and see the challenge that they have. And along the same lines is that I think with any teacher, there shouldn't be a tension between grace and justice, I guess, but there is, and sometimes you just don't know when to have grace for a student who's really struggling with other issues outside their academics, and when, how much to push them to get the work done, to be resilient, to saying they can do this. You can do this. I know it doesn't seem like you can, but I'm with you. I'm going to walk alongside you.
Rich Obenshane, while you do some instruction, have done plenty of speaking to people as a traditional teacher, most of what I'm aware you do by way of education is sending Gordon students and father-son and mother-daughter teams out into the wilderness where they slog around the Adirondacks and get bitten and rained on, and all sorts of other things happen to them, and that you and I both see as education. But how is it education? What is the kind of thrust of what you're hoping people will learn, and why do you send them out in the wilderness to do it?
Well, right now I've probably got about 30 people sitting on a mountaintop in New Hampshire having a quiet time, hopefully a mini solo for about 2 hours to dig into the Word. And I've really made a career of taking people out of their comfort zone and putting them in a very real situation where they have to dig down deep and find out what they're made of. That could be physically, it could also be spiritually, and also it's within a covenant group of people. And so they have to get along, they have to work together to overcome, they have to learn how to encourage one another and support one another. And by applying God's Word to those challenges, we're hoping that they are learning things at a much deeper level than just hearing a sermon. And so we call it experiential discipleship. And so Outward Bound, who kind of started this whole adventure program, had a quote that we use as well, and it said, "I heard and I forgot, I saw and I remembered, but I experienced and I understood." And so what we're trying to do is take a concept like commitment, or a verse like Joshua 12:5, and talking about the idea of holding fast to God or making a commitment move on a rock climb. And so we're trying to take those concepts and those Bible verses, or like Psalm 1 about digging deep roots and then therefore being able to prosper in all that you do, and really show kids how to live those out and how it'll make a difference in their life. And through the process of getting together and having them reflect and keep a journal and talk about it and think about it, trying to draw out the learning so that they can take that learning and apply it beyond the trip that they're on for the rest of their life.
So what keeps you going? What do you say when people want to cut your budget or ignore what it is you're doing?
I'm Jennifer Drake. I'm a speech and language assistant, and I've worked here in the Hamilton-Wenham Public Schools for about 16 years. And the reason I got into that was somewhat practical. I had young children. I went back to school to get some new skills, and I wanted to work a school schedule and have my summers off with my children, so it was somewhat practical. And another motivating factor was our daughter Rebecca, who has Down syndrome. Speech and language was obviously a challenge for her, and I thought I could perhaps help her a little bit and also bring some firsthand experience about dealing with speech and language challenges from my own child to bear with working with other people's children. Two things that I like to keep in mind as a speech and language assistant. I'm not a pathologist. I don't have my master's or that lovely CCC. But I've been doing this for 16 years. And the thing that kind of keeps me going would be, there's two things. I look upon all the students that I service as, I think it's from 1 John, as my flock. Those are the flock. Those are the children, the students that God has entrusted to me to do my best to try to meet their speech and language needs. And then another thing that I always need to keep in the back of my mind is that I am also in constant need of speech therapy. Whether it's saying the right thing, not saying something. We have a little joke at home. There's thought bubbles and there's speech bubbles. We all know people sometimes use speech bubbles that should have remained a thought bubble. But anyway, so that the Lord always needs to work on my heart as well in terms of my spiritual speech therapy that I need, ongoing.
My name is Rich Schoenwald. I teach over at Masconomet Regional High School. I've been teaching there, I guess, about 18 years. I'd started off in the engineering field, and it was actually through my involvement in Young Life, which kind of got me around high school kids and kind of realized that was where I wanted to spend my time. And I felt called out of engineering and into teaching.
I happened to teach the best of the best in a couple of my classes, and I also teach 3 sections of what's considered the low-level math class. And it's just fascinating to me, just the difference. And again, having kids of my own, I know it's so easy to get caught up in that, what percentile is my kid in? And it breaks my heart, and yet I can see that I'm a part of it. Some interesting things, just a generalization. When the AP kids are done with my course, for the most part, they're done with me. It's interesting. I'll see some of them next year, and it's as if I didn't exist. But the kids who are the low-level kids, Mr. Schoenwald, how are you? How was your summer? How are your kids? and again, it's just an interesting thing that I've experienced repeatedly. But I think we as a Christian body somehow need to be a part of this reorienting that our kids are not percentiles. And yet it's so easy to get caught up into that. There's like, well, if they're not doing well in math, then what future do they have? And I think somehow we need to do a better job of just like, we're all creations of God. He's not going to ask us our SAT scores when we get to heaven.
That's definitely one thing that we've tried to do, is talk about the redefinition of success, that just everybody would try things wholeheartedly, do their best with what they have, and kind of trust God for the results. And pretty soon, because we also don't make people do anything, we have another phrase called challenge by choice. So in a class where they might be on that day going up and doing a balance beam that's 45 feet up in the air, and they have a rope that holds 6,000 pounds, and they're connected to a 14,000 test cable, people are still afraid. And that doesn't compute to me because I love it up there. But I have to understand that they come with a lot of fears. And so by helping them to go up maybe halfway up the ladder one day and then come back and do 2 more rungs and eventually go up there, and they're not up there to prove anything, but they're kind of there to just see how they can put this idea of commitment into action, and then they really learn something from that.